Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you the 3 things you didn't know that are happening behind the scenes whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. But you must know if you want to have control, power and influence. You can read, watch or listen to the blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to show you another powerful tip and powerful strategy that helps you to have more control, power and influence, and in this week you will discover the 3 ways on how to turn the tables in your favor and have control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Fear, frustration, stress, struggle, challenge, the feeling of vulnerability, loss of control, the feeling of powerlessness and the lack of influence are all things you can resonate with if your loved one has been admitted to intensive care for critical illness. Furthermore, you feel like the intensive care team is talking over you and at you, but not really with you, and neither are they interested in getting your view of the situation. Nor can or will they empathize with what you and the rest of your family are really going through. This is hard to swallow, and you can feel your world is tumbling down, and you can see that other people are driving the bus, and that bus is going in a direction that you have absolutely no control over. Not a good position to be in. You feel like the intensive care team has all the power, or that's at least your perception of the situation. The intensive care team has already directly or indirectly told you that they are wielding all the power, control and influence in this situation, and the intensive care team really treats you as a passive bystander of the situation. That's how the intensive care team is framing the situation, and if you are like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you buy into that frame of mind and you wind up having no control, no power and no influence, and the intensive care team continues to drive the bus, and they make sure that you can't even look at the steering wheel. What do I mean by this? I mean that the intensive care team has an agenda, and that agenda is driven by the things that are happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Their agenda is driven by the psychology, by the power games, by the intrigue and by the politics in an intensive care unit. This is particularly true if your critically ill loved one is in a critical and dire situation. This is also true if the situation of your critically ill loved one is an uncertain and life-threatening situation, and it's also true if your critically ill loved one might be in a situation where a long-term stay in intensive care is on the horizon. That's when the intensive care team has an agenda, and that's when you need to carefully listen what the intensive care team is telling you and what they're not telling you. That's the time when you and your family need to position yourself correctly, and that's the time when you need to start asking questions. What type of questions? I'm glad you've asked. Now, if you are like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you won't ask any questions. You won't position yourself correctly, and the intensive care team will drive their agenda forward regardless. Unless you belong into that 1% bracket of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who actually do ask questions and position themselves correctly and strongly and have an agenda themselves, which actually is the best interest of your critically ill loved one. Those 1% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are actually able to turn the tables in their favor and have control, power and influence whilst their loved one is critically ill in intensive care. How do you do that? How can you turn the tables in your favor whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You will turn the tables in your favor whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care if you follow those 3 steps. Number 1, do your own research. Don't be intimidated by the intensive care team, and don't think that just because they are doctors and nurses that they know it all. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, and if you have been told that your critically ill loved one's situation is life-threatening and that your loved one might not survive their stay in intensive care, or if the intensive care team is telling you that a quote-unquote withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment is quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, you need to question those very assumptions of the intensive care team. Your job is to find out whether the clinical reality warrants for the intensive care team to suggest a withdrawal of treatment, or whether the intensive care team's positioning of your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis is dependent on other admissions waiting for precious and scarce ICU beds, or the financial viability of your critically ill loved one's treatment and stay in intensive care, or a good versus a bad business case, or the intensive care team has a negative mindset and doesn't believe in the recovery of your critically ill loved one. Some intensive care units, depending on their culture, positive versus negative, are prepared to do whatever it takes to get your critically ill loved one on their way to recovery, whereas other ICUs are negative and are not prepared to do whatever it takes. Your job is to find out why the intensive care team is suggesting what they are suggesting, and you can do that by number 2, asking difficult, challenging and inconvenient questions, such as the ones I have hinted towards in number 1. For example, does the intensive care team weigh your critically ill loved one's stay and treatment in intensive care up against financial indicators and against financial viability? By asking whether the intensive care team expects their beds to be fully occupied in the next few days or weeks, and if that's the case, the intensive care team may present your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis in a negative light to sell to you and your family that a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment is in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, and they therefore want to free up an expensive ICU bed as soon as possible for the next and maybe financially more viable admission. Number 3, don't suck up to the doctors and the nurses and don't put them on a pedestal. Just as I've mentioned earlier, the intensive care team frames the situation implicitly or explicitly as if they have all the control, power and influence in this situation. 99% of families of critically ill patients buy into that frame of mind, and they therefore believe, consciously or unconsciously, that they have no control, power and no influence. Turn it all around. Stop buying into that frame of mind, and therefore, as a first step, you need to stop sucking up to the intensive care team, because that's what 99% of families of critically ill patients do. Be in that 1% bracket of families of critically ill patients who have control, power and influence, and I can promise you that if you stop sucking up to the intensive care team, and if you do so consciously, the intensive care team will notice, because they are not used to it, and you will find that it'll change the dynamics in your favor immediately. How can you further leverage your level of power, influence and control whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? And how can you be in control of the situation? You'll get to that all-important feeling of power, control and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free instant impact report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free reports, you'll also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to control, power and influence in your situation. You'll get that crucial behind the scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.